Welcome to Law and Crime, everybody. Good morning. I'm Jesse Weber. I'm here with Brad Micklin, and thank you for joining us. Hope everybody had a great holiday season. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Where we're going today is we are going to recap some of the most memorable trials here this past year. Again, we're closing out 2019. We're coming into 2020. These are the trials that stuck with us. Right now, we're going to start with the trial of Jason Carter out of Iowa. This was the son who was accused of killing his mother. Yep, you heard that right. On June 19, 2015, 46-year-old Jason Carter walked into his parents' home and found his mother, 68-year-old Shirley Carter, dead on the floor. He calls 911, says he needs an ambulance, that there's blood everywhere. Mrs. Carter, she died due to gunshot wounds, but the question was this a burglary gone bad, or was this calculated murder by her son? Aaron Keller has more on the case.
Jason Carter of Iowa is accused of on the farm. Prosecutors say his financial struggles led him to kill his mother for money.
A farmer puts a seed and fertilizer into the ground and then waits for Mother Nature to produce her bounty. And during that time, they sometimes have very little income coming in. So they live on their credit line. The trick is to live within your means. And we'll learn the defendant didn't do that.
The defendant himself called 911 to report finding his mother Shirley shot.
911, where is your emergency?
I need an ambulance, man. It's Bill Carter. Someone's laying here on the floor. What? Where she's dead? I don't know what happened.
Prosecutors say the defendant originally resisted making the call.
That the evidence will establish that at 11:08, for some reason, the defendant called and talked to his sister 3 minutes before he calls 911.
Shirley Carter died at the scene, and the defendant, prosecutors say, seemed to know a little too much about what had happened.
The defendant knew been shot with a rifle owned by his father during an attempted burglary, and the shooter took the rifle with him when he left.
The prosecutor thinks Carter staged an apparent burglary. Money, jewelry, and valuable prescriptions were untouched. What, then, was he after? Perhaps an inheritance.
On the day of the homicide, their business account and their personal accounts both had less than $100 in them. And the credit line, it was nearly tapped out.
The defense focused on a statement from the defendant's father.
Bill Carter says, I know what rigor mortis is. I was a butcher. She was stiff as a board, she was cold.
In other words, the state's timeline doesn't add up.
And I believe everyone who testifies will agree that if that's true, it would be impossible for Jason Carter to have been the killer. Jason was over at the house. He spent time with his mother, that his mother was proud of him, happy with him, that they were together often, and that none of them had seen friction, sadness.
This is Aaron Keller for the Law and Crime Network.
All right, Brad, let's break this down. The prosecution had an interesting case here. When you first heard about it, they said that this man had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to kill his mother. What did you think about the state's case?
I mean, when you listen to it, it sounds compelling, and I have to assume they wouldn't have brought it if they didn't have something compelling to show, but I'm still having trouble tying that motive. I'm still waiting to see the actual financial gain that he had. I mean, they talk about a possible inheritance. Now, under the law, he wouldn't have inherited, but maybe he didn't know that. Maybe that's something that we don't know. But it's hard to tie this gruesome of a murder to the potential of an inheritance.
Look, the state believes that he did this, and the state's not the only one. Bill Carter, who's Shirley Carter's husband, the father of the defendant, believes that his son murdered his wife. And we know this because we're about to play you his testimony, but it should also be noted that in 2015, he sues his son, and his son is found civilly responsible for this shooting. And it's a really, really disturbing case. So I want to go now to Bill Carter, and he testified against his son in open court. This is a sad case where a family just seems absolutely destroyed. A father suing and ultimately winning a judgment against his son, now testifying against him in his criminal trial. What did you think about that?
Well, testifying against him is not so unusual, especially when you consider it was his spouse that was murdered. The civil trial is unique. I mean, obviously, as you know, it's a lower standard, but it's just not common. one, it's still difficult to prove. Two, you don't usually want to go through this much when you've already lost a spouse, had to testify against your son. Even with his upset with his son, a lot of people still have sympathy to their children even when they do something so horrible. So the fact that that occurred and such a large judgment is a really interesting piece that I just don't fully understand yet.
Let's just take a step back. When's this $10 million judgment against him? Just because you're found civilly responsible, that's a very different standard than criminally responsible. We saw it in the OJ case, right? How to explain that to our viewers?
Well, the civil standard is preponderance, which means if this is all the proof, you have to have just a little bit more than, let's say, half, or being equal. Where in criminal, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, which means you have to be up here. So it's a much more challenging burden of proof. So it's easier for a civil jury to find this much more in the father's favor, especially when you have loss of spouse. He's obviously an older man who's a farmer. He's got to be working hard. So there could have been a lot of sympathy that played into it. Unlike a criminal trial where you need to find that beyond all reasonable doubt of the proof, this was committed, and that's why he has such a large judgment against him.
The difficulty for the defense is the victim, though, right? I mean, this is not somebody who was engaged in a multifaceted criminal enterprise, who had a lot of enemies. She's murdered in her home. So this concept of perhaps it was a burglary or was it a staged burglary, we've seen cases like that before as well, right?
Right. Well, and they think in this case it was staged. There's a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of things that did point to Jason. He didn't want to call 911 at first. I think he lied about knowing about the gun safe and his fingerprints were on it. His cell phone was missing, a gun was missing. So there are a lot of pieces at this stage that really point towards him. But the financial motive that the father was testifying to still doesn't do it for me, because it sounded like Jason knew both parents had to die for him to inherit. And unless he expected both to be there, that wouldn't have happened that day.
I remember there was some inclination during the course of this trial that perhaps he was going to target his father as well in this. I'll tell you what, we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to hit the testimony more of Bill Carter. More importantly, how does a defense cross-examine this witness? A very sensitive witness. It's tough. When we come back, we'll play that for you. Stay tuned.